and you get different conditional probability as the same.
Okay, let's come back to order. Our first speaker of the afternoon is Toby Meadows, also from here in Logic and Philosophy Science at UCI Irvine, who's going to tell us what theories are and when they are equivalent.
We'll see. Okay, thanks very much for having me here. Today I want to talk about a couple of things. So I want to think about what we mean when we say theories T and S are equivalent for some purpose. I've left the in purpose part in parentheses because I think it's very important philosophically, but I'm not going to focus on that today. Rather, I'm going to focus on some technical issues pertaining to theories of equivalence. So first of all, why am I here? So I'm a philosopher of mathematics who predominantly works with mathematical logic to study problems regarding to theory comparison with alternative foundations of mathematics. So I know almost nothing about physics. However, I am very interested in understanding how theory comparison works in physics and how it might differ from working foundations of mathematics. I think there are some interesting differences. I'm hoping also to say kind of a few stupid things in the hope that this will help me learn more. So I want to maybe a different kind of giraffe space. I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit and see if this can help me learn more. Okay, so my plan is to ask two very naive questions. What is a theory? When might we think that two theories are equivalent, right? So these are huge questions. I'm not going to get very far with them, so I'm not going to take anything comprehensive or definitive. My goal rather is to sort of chart a course across these questions that bumps into a few interesting problems. So there'll be three sort of problems that will emerge, and think about how this intersects with my previous work and things that I'm thinking about now. All right, so here's the kind of map. We're going to talk about what a theory is. This will be a bit of exposition to try and warm us up on how equivalence works. And then I'm going to ask these two questions, which probably don't mean too much yet. So these are these interesting questions that I think are interesting that I'm mucking around with at the moment. Okay, so theories. What is a theory? In mathematical logic, we have a very simple definition. So it's a set of sentences closed under consequence. Classic example of this would be ZFC, although there are many other examples. And we generally like there to be some sense of, in some sense, there only be finite and many axioms. Okay, so we like that kind of thing, so we can actually use it. This characterization has a very syntactic and feels it's kind of difficult to use, but there are other perspectives. So for example, given a theory T understood as a set of sentences, it's convenient to work with a set of models that satisfy T, which we denote like this mod T. It's the set of models that satisfy T, sort of structures. I use those more or less synonymously. So we might call this a semantic as opposed to a syntactic perspective. Sometimes we want to even go further. We want to constrain the class of models beyond the expressive limits of one. I'll call these strong logics because I've got a sort of a set theory background. So that's what I would call them, but there are other ways of talking about it. So for example, if we're using a theory like ZFC, we might want to rule out the garbage models that are ill-founded because we don't think that's what ZFC is about. So we want to restrict ourselves to the well-founded models, which are then canonically represented by these things called transitive sets. So we might call this mod trans. It's going to give us the the transitive models of ZFC rather than the ones that have. Okay, but there's no syntactic theory. So there's no theory T extending ZFC that can capture this. So it's unaxiomatizable. It's beyond what we can actually capture with a theory, yet it's something that's very convenient to use. So there's no theory that we can add here that will give us the transitive models of ZFC. We need to do something on the outside. Okay. So this is good though. The semantic perspective thus offers us a way of obtaining greater control over the structures we're considering. And this distinction, as people know, has a number of incarnations. So David talked about a few of these. So in logic, we tended to make the syntax versus semantics distinction. I think David's right to criticize the semantics. We use this in a very loose kind of way. We might have this language first versus mathematics first, or from a mathematics geometric context, we might have synthetic versus analytic approaches. Okay, so a rough intuition, and I stress rough, is the syntactic perspective gives this kind of internal perspective where we describe, so to speak, what's going on around us in our language. Whereas the semantic perspective is more internal. We sort of use our ambient mathematics to sort of build structures that represent something in the world very broadly construed. So I don't want to get to that kind of metaphysics. Okay, so the semantic perspective is, however, very useful. So in general, in mathematical logic, it almost always provides a clearer perspective from which to attack problems. So it's very rare that the syntactic perspective is easier to use. Now I'm going to stick my neck out of it. So my understanding, in inverted commas, is that in physics, semantics perspectives are generally preferred. So there seem to be a number of good reasons for this that seem good to me, but I'm happy to be corrected on this kind of thing. So physicists have more pressing problems. They're busy figuring out how the world works, and they don't need the people like me going, hey, have you given it a first order theory? So, that's fine. That's good. Another kind of problem is I think it's not so easy to figure out how to untangle the math from the physics. So this is something I know much less about, but I've sort of been dabbling with. But this problem here is probably a more serious one, or it's an actual roadblock. Physics theories might not be amenable to axiomatization in first order logic. So you might just not be able to axiomatize them. Okay, so with regard to 3, I want to talk about this one a little bit today, and I'm going to say some bad things, and there's not really something positive as well. So I understand physics theories use manifolds, and manifolds have topology in them. So, okay, so but that's enough of a problem already, and that's what I want to try and stress here. So if we want to even talk about topology, it's not clear that that's really a theory. That's what I'm going to try and talk about here. So a topology is a structure. We have a set X, and then you have a family of subsets of that set there, which is the topology. Then you have the intersection operation and the union operation, and plus some other stuff. We'll talk about that when we get to it later. But the problem is that this structure does not fit within first order logic. Okay, so while this guy here is a binary operation, so can happily be represented in first order logic, this fellow here takes arbitrary subsets of X, which are generally not finite. So the upshot, it's not obvious that theories involving topology can be represented by theories in first order logic. So that's a big roadblock right at the beginning. Okay, so just to sort of flag, this is the ghost line here. I'm going to come back to this and say something perhaps a little positive about this later on, something that I've been thinking about for a long time, but wait till we get to it. Okay, but I think there are also costs with the semantic perspective. So what I want to try and do with this is give an informal characterization of the difference of something a bit touchy-feely with Quine, known for his touchy-feeliness, and a more formal example where we can sort of illustrate the difference mattering. Okay. All right, so informally, I think there's something like a use-mention distinction going on. So syntactically, we can either we can mention theories, or we can speak in those languages and we can use them. So for example, I can, when I'm doing mathematics, I can talk about ZFC as a theory. It's like a set of coded sentences. And when I'm doing this, I'm using my background in mathematics, so perhaps something like ZFC itself. And so in some sense, I'm using ZFC to talk about ZFC. But on the other hand, with semantic approach, it seems that I can only mention collections of structures or models. So I'm talking about them from the outside, I build them in my mathematics, and that's sort of an extra remove I want to suggest. I don't want to play too, so I cannot speak the language of topology. If we take what seriously what I've said before, then I'm not in a position to, so to speak, use that theory, at least in the same way that we can use ZFC. I don't want to overstate the importance of this point, so I'm probably not really interested in a priority claim. What I really just want to say is I want to highlight there's a certain intimacy that the syntactic perspective has with regard to the objects that it tries to represent. So it's just literally speaking language of this thing. Okay. All right, so that's a touchy-feely Quine use-mention way of doing things. More formally, I'd like to offer a little argument that illustrates this use-mention discrepancy. And it's going to illustrate that it isn't merely a matter of semantics. There is something substantive perhaps to it. Okay, so because I'm a mathematician, I'm going to choose a mathematical example. So suppose I'm doing some mathematics in ZFC and I decide to take up a semantic perspective and consider the transitive models of ZFC because I think they're great. Okay, what set theorists do. So I might be interested in what is true in all of these transitive models of ZFC. So you can think of this, it's analogous to considering a collection of space-time. So I'm going to consider all the things that are true in all of these models of ZFC. Okay, since these structures are merely being mentioned at this point, I'm describing them from the outside, they're arguably just toy models until I describe what they are intended to represent. Okay, but I think in this case, since we're already doing set theory, so up there, there's an obvious story about representation. We might think that these models are providing a reasonable models of what we think ZFC actually describes. So with the idea is that arbitrarily, if we consider the things that these are good models, so the things that are true in all of these good models should actually be true, which is what's said under here. So as such, we might think that sentences that are true in all transitive models of ZFC are in fact true. I can squeeze this. I think I've made that much worse. Okay. Go the other way. We could just get rid of the full screen. Let's do that. They've changed Acrobat. No, I don't like it. screen mode.
It's in read mode, not the problem. Try control L and see what's happening.
I don't have a keyboard, alas. I think this is okay though, isn't that? It's people, there's a little bit of white, it's not black on the side, so it's quite clear, but hopefully it's okay. All the words are there. All right, so more formally though, so the idea here is we want to take the sentences that are true in every transitive model of ZS. We want to take them seriously and think they're actually true. Well, this has a nice little bridging principle. So we're saying if something's true in every transitive model of ZSE, then it's just true. So we add this to our theory. We might think, okay, that's a reasonable principle to have. But if we do this, it seems like a sensible principle, I claim. It's also known as a reflection principle. It turns out it does make a difference. The resultant theory implies that there is a transitive model of ZSC, and this is something that ZSC alone cannot prove. In fact, this can be regarded as a weak version of a large cardinal axiom. Indeed, this kind of process of collecting up models and figuring out what's true in all of them is a way in which we generate large cardinal axioms in set theory. So the key point here is this extra remove of mentioning rather than using can have an effect on the theory, can actually make a substantive difference. Okay, but I should be a little careful here. ZFC is a very, very, very strong theory. It's kind of like the strongest theory that you use unless you're a set theorist. So not all theories are subject to this kind of Gödelian phenomena that I've just used here. So I've just used a version of Gödel's second incompleteness theorem to make this point. So we might draw a rough line through the space of theories with a few distinctives which are well known. So we might consider the theories that have models with many automorphisms or models which are rigid, at least in their intended version. So examples like arithmetic is rigid, it has no automorphisms. They can define the natural numbers versus ones that cannot, so that cannot define them versus the ones that can use compactness arguments versus ones that cannot, and cannot interpret, I beg your pardon, Robinson arithmetic versus can interpret Q. So arithmetic's playing a big role in here, as you can kind of see. But the rough kind of guide is, are model theorists interested in them? These are things with automorphisms in them. And if set theorists are interested in them, they're usually kind of rigid. It's a rough kind of guiding line. Okay, so this is how a mathematical logician would try and divide the space of theories. Okay, so here's my kind of dumb question. What kinds of theories are physics theories? Now, I don't know the answer to this at all. I feel like you have a lot of automorphisms going around, but you're also using a lot of rigid structure in the form of the reals. So this is just my own naivety. Maybe this is a question for later that people can help me with. But it doesn't seem to fit, the theories that I'm seeing don't seem to fit neatly into the kinds of theories that mathematical logicians are generally interested in. Okay, so at the moment I'm posing more problems than offering solutions. However, I think there is a really simple way of a very general definition that meets almost all of our needs. So it's going to be an analytic or external kind of approach. So we might say that theory is a collection of mathematical structures of a particular form. So a mathematical structure would be an ordered pair A, where we have D and sigma. D is a sequence, D0, D1, and so on, which we call domains. And then sigma is a sequence of relations and functions on and between those domains, which we might call a signature. Okay. So the form of the structure is determined by the domains and the arities of the relations and functions. I'll leave open whether they're finitary or not, so we'll allow the possibility of infinitary operations. Okay, I claim this captures all the examples I know of. Maybe people have some counterexamples of theories in the hard sciences. So I think it's a very big bucket. So for example, any axiomatizable theory of first order logic determines a theory in this sense. Any theory of first order logic determines a theory in this sense. So for example, a set of countable transitive models. So even so, just beyond theory, now we're putting an external constraint, this transitivity constraint on. This fits this constraint. And for another example, the class of second countable topologies is a theory in this sense, or apparently lacks a language to express it. Okay, so this is a very general setting, and hopefully then it provides a good place to begin our discussion of how equivalence might work. So this is what we're going to try and treat a theory as. I'll refine it at some point later on. Okay, equivalence. What does it mean to say that all two theories are equivalent? So the first thing we know, we've got something like an equivalence relation going. But I think there are two dominant kinds of equivalence relations that are useful here. So equivalence relations that are determined by what I might call a back and forth argument, and I don't have a great name, squinting or blurring. We'll come to those at the end. Okay. Generally, I think the back and forth arguments are more philosophically significant. But now I'd like to try and give you a bit of a quick précis on what these things are. So here's a rough sketch of this. Suppose we have S and T, which are theories in the sense that I've just described above. A back and forth argument is an equivalence relation that takes natural functions, F from the structures of T to the structures of S and G in the other direction, such that if you're in a T structure and you go over to S and then back, you end up close enough to A, so to where you started. And similarly, if you start from a B structure. Okay, so we transform T structures into S structures, and we transform them back and vice versa. We end up close enough to where we started. Of course, the whole thing here swings on how natural these functions are and what close enough. So I haven't described. This is it's a very rough template. Squinting and blurring, this is the other type of argument we see. This time we start with a particular structure, so it's more structure focused rather than theory focused from T, and then again, I'm going to be very metaphoric. We kind of round off its edges with some natural function f. So we might think of this as removing corners or filling in gaps in the structure. We might think of this as blurring the distinctive and distracting features of A away. If we also have a similar structure G for structures B from S, then we might argue that T and S are equivalent when we can blur T and blur S and get the same collections of structures. Or more formally, pointwise image of T via F is equal to the pointwise image of S via G. Okay, so these are two different ways we might think about how to do this. Okay, again, of course, everything swings here on the naturalness of what this blurring function is. So is it doing the right kind of thing? In this very general setting, there's no difference between these approaches. So the axiom of choice just rips them apart. There's nothing significant there. So we want to get something more, we have to put more meat on the bones and constrain it somehow. Okay. So what I would like to do is discuss some examples of natural functions giving rise to what I think are philosophically significant equivalences based on back and forth arguments. This is going to take a little while, but right at the very end, I'm going to make this little gesture toward blurring arguments, and hopefully there'll be a sort of natural place for me to stop. Okay. So what makes functions good for a back and forth argument? Okay, I want to start with what I think is the gold standard, which is known as definitional equivalence or sometimes synonymy. Then I want to pose some problems that will lead us immediately to more general perspectives with categorical isomorphism and reader equivalence, which is given to us by Thomas and Hartz. Then I want to come up with two difficult examples from topology and class theory. And these will be the two final sections that I paper. And this will eventually lead us back to blurring arguments, I promise. Okay. So definitional equivalence. I'm going to describe how it works. So suppose we've got particularly nice theories, T and S, with the special property that they're generated by sets of sentences. So we've got gamma T and gamma S. So we're saying T is the set of structures satisfying gamma T, and S is the set of structures satisfying gamma S. This is it's common in mathematical logic. It doesn't seem very common in physics from what I can see, from a very external point of view. Okay, so then we say that these theories are definitionally equivalent if we have translations from the language of S to the language of T, and going the other direction from the language of T to the language of S, such that we have this is going to be a bit messy, but I'm going to tidy this up in the next slide. So what this says is everything S can prove, T can prove, and everything T can prove, S can prove through the translations. And this thing here roughly says, given any formula in LT, if you translate it over to LS and then back, you end up with something that has, in some sense, you might say the same meaning. So what we're saying here is that the back and forth doesn't affect the meaning of an expression. But the preservation of meaning, I think, is what licenses to think of this as the gold standard. So it's almost always good evidence that such theories are merely providing different ways of talking about the same stuff. So they're really the same theory. However, this definition is very syntactic and busy, and it doesn't really fit my back and forth template so well. So there's a semantic point of view which is better. Okay. So suppose we have a translation from LS to LT, and T interprets S. So this means T, so this gamma T proves everything S does via the translation. Well, this then determines a function which we might call T star from the structures of T to the structures of S. That's a really simple kind of idea. Essentially, we're using the translation to define an internal model of S within any structure of T. So you're in a model of S, you're in a model of T, and then you describe inside it a model of S. Okay? This is a way of interpreting. So it also then gives a much simpler definition of definitional equivalence, which we have as follows then. So we say that these theories are definitionally equivalent if we have these functions going in both directions, determined by translations, such that if you go from A, if you're in a T structure A, and you translate and translate again, you end up exactly where you started. And similarly in the other direction if you start with a B structure. Okay, so this then does fit into it's easy to read, I think, and it does fit into our back and forth template. And in general, when you're doing these arguments, this is usually the natural place to work. Okay, so are there any examples of definitionally equivalent theory? So here's a few. Okay, so classic one, if you have the theory of linear orders, defined, axiomatized using the less than relation, this is going to be definitionally equivalent to the theory of linear orders formulated with the less than or equal to relation. How do we do it? Well, if I'm in this language and I want to define that, I'm going to say this or equals. Simple, right? And there's an analogous translation in the other direction. But there are more complicated ones. Piano arithmetic, so it's everyone's favorite theory of arithmetic, is definitionally equivalent to what we might call finite ZFC. I don't want to specify what it is, but essentially throw away the axiom of infinity and add its negation. But there's a little tidying to do as well. Another example, though, so ZFC is definitionally equivalent to Axel's ill-founded set theory. So this is a variation that gets through the axiom foundation and starts talking about ill-founded sets. But these theories are all, so start to see something a little interesting here. Even though I'm saying they meet this gold standard, a lot of people would think that these are quite distinct theories. They have a different kind of content or at least a different kind of intention. So there's philosophical work to do here, even when you have these kinds of relationships. Okay, so a pleasing feature, though, of definitional equivalence is it connects very directly with language and the ways that we talk about the world. So, but as with a lot of gold standards, it's stronger often than what we really want. So here's a classic example of this from Thomas and Hans. Category theory can be articulated in a couple standard ways. So one way we can do it is we can axiomatize in the language with two sorts, objects and arrows. But it's quite easy to see that the object is kind of merely a convenient addition to the theory, and it can actually just be articulated with one sort, just using the arrows. Okay. We don't need to know what category theory is too much to talk about this, but both of these theories fit our abstract definition of a theory, and they're obviously the same theory. Anyone using them would go, yeah, they're the same thing. We just made a sort of slight change to things. But they're not definitionally equivalent. Okay, so that's a bit of a pain. They're not even mutually interpretable. So a more general perspective is required. So the thing that's gone wrong is one theory is two-sorted and one theory is one-sorted, and the ordinary apparatus of interpretation doesn't usually allow us to do this. Okay, so we require a more general notion of a back and forth function. So we'll also, to this point, pay to generalize our notion of a theory. So thus far, we've just been thinking of them as collections of structures. Now I want to make them a category of structures, and this will allow us to sort of bury the syntactic sort of stuff that's causing us grief. So this time we'll make the objects be the structures of the category, and the category also has arrows, visual formulations, and these are going to be nice maps between those structures. Okay. So the rough idea is the arrows allow us to bury problems about syntax and language. They also raise questions about which arrows are the right arrows. But in the case where we have structures based on theorized by a first order language, as we do here, elementary embeddings seem to be the right choice. And this is from Thomas and Hans. The crucial back and forth functors then will be functors, and these are just essentially the homomorphisms and categories, so structure preserving maps. Okay. So in this setting, though, we see that two theories T and S, understood as categories, are categorically isomorphic if there are functors F and G going backwards and forwards, such that if you are an object or an arrow and you go from the T world to the S world and back, you end up exactly where you started. And similarly, if you start with an object or an arrow from the S world. So now we have something that fits very clearly our back and forth template, although we have to deal with arrows as well as objects. It's less clear what the linguistic story is, but the underlying idea of transforming one theory into another and back remains. Okay. It's then not difficult to show that category theory with objects and arrows is categorically isomorphic to category theory with just arrows. So I'm using category theory to do category theory. That's just what interests me. So we have a back and forth equivalence between two theories that are intuitively equivalent with each other. So that's nice. But unlike the case of definitional equivalence and its linguistic cousins, it's arguably less clear how the equivalence works. So this is a natural place for Barrett and Hollefson's reader equivalence to make an entrance. So I want to try and talk about that very briefly. So rather than diving all the way into the external perspective offered by a categorical isomorphism, reader equivalence might be understood as a kind of halfway house. So recall the problem was that one version of category theory was multi-sorted while the other only had one sort. Well, Merida interpretation allows us to construct very natural new domains. So I'm going to use in this talk, domains and sorts are going to be roughly synonymous for my purposes here. There are reasons why you should be careful about it, but it won't matter to you. So the new domains constructions that are going to be familiar to anyone who works in type theory or category theory, we're going to add products, co-products, subsorts, and quotients. Okay, so I don't want to do all of them, but I want to talk about subsorts because they're probably the easiest to explain. Okay, suppose I'm working in a reasonably strong theory of the real numbers, then it might be convenient to expand my language with a new domain for the natural numbers. So I want to do a bit of number theory in my theory as well. Okay, since the natural numbers are going to be definable in a reasonably strong theory, we can define this sort and simply add it to our language. So this would be a reader expansion with the subsort. In the category theory example, there's a simple way to fix this. So we can define the subsort of identity arrows, then we're just going to treat those things as though they were objects. Okay, So Morita interpretation gives us a natural way of extending our ability to define new models. Rather than merely defining one structure within another, we're able to expand the structure with new domains or sorts. Okay. Thus we have a kind of we have somewhere that seems to be in between definitional equivalence and categorical isomorphism. Indeed, we can make that precise. So in fact, the functions determined, or I should say functors. The functors determined by translations in both standard and Morita interpretations also determine functors in the category theories. So it can then be seen that any standard interpretation is a Morita interpretation, and any Morita interpretation is a function in the category theories. Okay. We have a hierarchy then of equivalence relations between theories. We have definitional equivalence, arguably at the top, Morita equivalence, and then categorical isomorphism. I'm using isomorphism rather than equivalency just for technical reasons, but I won't go into it. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, I now want to consider a couple of problems that aim to push deeper and perhaps beyond this kind of framework. So the first question I have is what happens, so the examples we've given so far, I looked at category theory. What happens if we're looking at theories that don't fit into multi-sorted first-order logic? What am I going to do in those sorts of situations? And the second thing is I've got this nice little hierarchy here. I want to know a little bit more about what is in the space between Morita equivalence and categorical isomorphism. So those are my two guiding questions for the rest of the talk. Okay. So we noted above that not all theories can be axiomatized in first-order logic, and topology was particularly difficult because its standard definition makes use of an infinitary operation. First-order logic, like ordinary language, can only accommodate infinitary operations because sentences you have to be able to finish them. So I'd like to consider an example of a standard equivalence in topology and see if category theory can accommodate it. This is my first little project. And then I'm going to make a surprising and yet obvious, something I've known for a long time, observation that this can be linked back to an ordinary interpretability kind of result, somewhat generalized. Okay, so first of all, we're going to recall a little bit more specifically what a topology is. So we have a set X and then a family of subsets of X, which we call T, such that the empty set's in there and X is in there. It's closed under finite intersections and it's closed under arbitrary units. So that's a topology. Okay, so this definition is, I should mention, I want to emphasize, this is a definition rather than an axiomatization because I'm defining it from the outside. This is analytic or a math first approach. The final clause gives us difficulty since the union operation is not finitary. So in regard to topology then as being the class of all structures, we're going to give this a name, top, and it's a category of structures of this form satisfying this definition here. Now to make a bit of a comparison, I want to introduce an old definition of topology due to Felix Hausdorff. So this time we're going to do it slightly differently. We start with X and we describe how a neighborhood function works. It's going to be this thing N. And what does it do? It takes points from X, so elements of this thing, and returns the neighborhoods. Okay. And then we describe how it works as follows. Any neighborhood of a point, it's got to contain that point. Any superset of a neighborhood is still a neighborhood. An intersection, so the neighborhoods are going to be closed under finite intersections. And this is the more interesting one, any neighborhood has a subset that is a neighborhood of all its points. This is known as an open set. So this gives you the clue as how many things relate to each other. So we might then regard this definition as describing a theory house, which is the class of all of these structures, Xn, satisfying this definition. Okay, why have I brought these things up? So first thing to mention maybe is this topology definition is more awkward to use, not so commonly used these days, but it's well known to be equivalent to the standard formulation. It's very easy to do this, but how does this work? So interpretability seems to be off the table since I don't have a finitary language to work in. Okay, given our remarks above, the obvious thing to do perhaps is try the category theoretic approach. So we need then to figure out what our arrows in the relevant categories for these theories are going to be. We didn't mention this, but it's not obvious. We're doing topology, so the obvious choice is they're going to be continuous functions between various topologies. Okay. It's then not difficult to see that top and house are categorically isomorphic. So the category theoretic approach allows us to formally understand an intuitive equivalence. So that's good again. But it turns out we can do a little better. This is something that I want to think more about. And we can get something very close to definitional equivalence. So rather than using structures of the form xt and xn, I'm going to expand with extra domains. So I'm going to replace, in top, I'm going to replace xt with this guy here. So x, I'm also going to have its power set and the power set of its power set. So this is the set of subsets of x, and this is the set of subsets of that. And I'm going to call this top star. And house, I'm going to do the same kind of thing. I'm just going to add 2 extra domains here, and we'll have the membership relation as well. We'll call this house star. Big expansion though. So it's, in some way we're adding new domains, adding new sorts. There's a similar kind of theme running through these sorts of arguments. Okay, so to see the effect of this change, I want to note that actually in this structure now, intersection is definable. And more interestingly, this union thing, because it actually takes elements of the power set of the power set of X, is both definable and now finitary. Okay, so the upshot of this is we were able to build enough of the surrounding mathematical structure to finitize the union operation. So the effect of this is that we stay in these restricted class of structures. The definition we had of topology can now be converted into a first order logic. And so thus top star is axiomatizable over these very special structures. So in my world, I think of this as it's axiomatizable in a very strong logic. Okay, similar remarks also hold for house star. So this means the interpretation is then back on the table and then can be used using a very standard argument that top star is definitionally equivalent to house star. Okay. Essentially, any superset of an open set containing Z is a neighborhood of Z, and any neighborhood that is a neighborhood of all of its elements is an open set. So you can just define back and forth in a very, very easy way. So I want to stress that this result is not very interesting in itself. The thing I think that's interesting, it provides a way of understanding this equivalence as a species of definitional equivalence, albeit in a strong logic. Okay. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this yet, but I think it raises some interesting questions. So here's a very naive question. Can every category theoretic isomorphism between theories be represented as a definitional equivalence in a natural expansion of those theories? Okay. At the moment, this question is far too imprecise. It could have like a trivially true answer. Just if you build enough structure, then and you're just going to find the definition eventually. So I don't know quite how to refine this question yet. It needs to be tidied. But there's also something annoyingly kind of obvious about it as well. So I've been aware of these tricks for years. I think I spoke to Jim about this when I first started here a long time ago now. But I was being very shy of using this trick. And so I'll try and explain why. My reason is that using power set twice over a structure of any kind should give us pause. Okay, so why is that? It suggests that deep set theory sort of stuff might be tangled up with physics. As much as it would be really great for set theory, if that were true, I don't think it is true. So why do I say that? If you do power set twice, you're in kind of the zone of the continuum hypothesis. You can have all these questions that we have, that set theory is just puzzled by. We don't want physics to be puzzled by these sorts of questions. You've got your own problems. Okay, so I think this is extremely interesting. I think this is really unlikely to be true, but I'd like to figure out how to tie off this loose end. And I haven't, this is new work at the moment, so I don't know quite. I have, however, a couple of things to say about it. First thing, the tangling worry with the set theory can be ameliorated if we use second countable topologies. So if we use those, then we can axiomatise using the basis, the countable basis, and then, just to give you an idea, the topologies are then robust under forcing, which is good enough for saying it's not really that tangled in set. But I also think this power set angle should be explored further. I think it's something interesting about it, and I don't know how to constrain it and do the right thing with it. The basic idea of it is to add as much mathematical structure, so add as many domains as required to build one structure within another. Okay. And this is, again, related to equivalences based on work. How am I going to? Yeah, I'm going okay. So what is in between Morita equivalence and categorical isomorphism? Just my next kind of question. So I think this is related to the last question, but things are starting to get a little foggy around this kind of area. So for the topology domain, recall we added new domains using the overpowered power set operation. Didn't really like that. Whereas Morita interpretation does a similar kind of thing. It adds domains which are modest in some sense and untangled with set theory. Okay. So in this section, I want to look at what lies in between Morita equivalence and categorical isomorphism. So this is also related to the idea of blurring arguments. So let's keep emphasizing that. So we're going to add new stuff, so new domains to our structures until we cannot tell the difference between them. That's the goal. All right. So I want to try and motivate this now. So I'm going to try and provide what I think is a relatively natural way of thinking about how you might go further than Morita equivalence. So when we add, with a typical Morita expansion, we add a new domains like a subsort. This is then essentially the definable subset of the original domain, assuming you started in a single sort of language. Okay. Once we have that, we are free to quantify within that new domain. So that's nice. We've got this new domain. So like the example with the natural numbers, now I can start talking about things inside the natural numbers. That's nice. What if we want to go crazy? What if we wanted to add a lot of new subsorts? Perhaps we want to add all of them. Now, there are technical things about why I have to be more careful that I'm being here, but let's just pretend that makes some sense. You've probably got the basic idea. So then, if we added all of them, wouldn't it seem natural to want to quantify over those domains? So what do I mean by that is not just quantify within them, but why don't we let the new domains be objects themselves of a further new domain? So this seems like a natural place. So if you've got reader equivalents, then you want to go, okay, maybe I want to be able to quantify over all of the new sorts that I added using reader equivalents. I mean, this would become reader interpretation. Okay, so this seems to me anyway like at least one natural way to go beyond reader interpretation. But it raises questions. How does it work? And is it legit? Okay, so I want to try and argue that it is, but our results are going to be kind of mixed. So a standard mathematical example of this kind of thing occurs in the relationship between ZFC, which is the standard set theory, and a more exotic guy called Gödel-Bennet set theory. Let's spend a moment at the end. As every set theory student knows, in ZFC, if we're using ZFC, there is no set of all sets, and there's no set of all ordinals. However, these are not proper classes, but another way we might think of them is definable subsorts of the domain. So you can define the set of all sets. It's the set of all sets that are equal to themselves. You define the set of all ordinals very easily as well. But actually, I shouldn't say set, the class of all ordinals. And you can think of these as subsorts of new domains. Okay, so what Gödel-Bennet's set theory does is it allows us to quantify over these new subsort domains, not merely within them. Okay. So one can think of this more sort of picturesquely as you've got your cumulative hierarchy. Let's get rid of the numbers. How we always draw it, like V, and then on the top, and then you have this little, well, quite a lot of these things. These are where your classes go, they go on top. Sets there. That picture will actually be helpful for us. All right, so as to the legitimacy of this theory, let's observe how close it is to ZFC. So the first thing we know is that they're actually equiconsistent. So if you're worried about using really strong theories and whether they could be inconsistent, we don't have great evidence, or we certainly can't prove them mathematically that either of these theories are consistent. So if you're worried about that, well, if you're happy with ZFC, then you should probably be happy with GBN and vice versa. So that's one thing we have. Next thing we know is that any model M of ZFC can be extended to a model M star of the class theory simply by adding the classes on top. So I'm relying on if you've got this, then you can just pop those guys up. Okay? Now this has a nice little corollary to it. It tells me that any statement about sets that can be proven in the big theory can already be proven in ZFC. So it's not proving anything new. So this is often what we call means it's a conservative extension of ZFC. Now, to relate this back, Morita expansions also have this property. So they always give us conservative extensions. However, Morita expansions also have a stronger conservativity property. So here's a specification of a theorem from Hans and Thomas. If T star is a Morita expansion of T and phi is a sentence of the expanded language, then there is a sentence psi of the original language such that it's equivalent to it. So we see any new sentence can already be expressed by an old sentence. You're not getting any more expressive power. You can formally say that. However, no expansion of ZFC to GBN enjoys this property. So Morita expansions have a stronger conservativity, but we still have some conservativity with the passage from ZFC to GBN, but not this. Okay. So we can see both conceptually and mathematically that quantifying other classes is in some sense taking us beyond Morita interpretation. That leaves us with our next question then. So we're beyond, but are we still in between Morita equivalence and categorical isomorphism? So the answer to this question is kind of. All right, so a couple of questions to sort of get us motivated toward showing this result. Why would we think that these things are equivalent in the first place? And what is the appropriate category for assessing their equivalence? So first question was so hard, the second question took a lot of stuff. So regarding their equivalence, we first need to move to a modification of GBN, which I'm going to call GBN. The essential idea behind it is rather than having arbitrary kinds of classes above it, I'm just going to add the smallest amount of classes I can. Essentially, I'm going to add a class for every formula. So every definable class will be represented, but nothing more. If I don't do this, I get a retraction relation rather than an equivalence. It only also, the way to fix this in addition to the theory, only works in omega models, which means these are models get the natural numbers right. So that's a clue towards the category. I have to have at least that. Then we observe any model of ZFC gives us a model of GBN. So this is the story I told over here. Got a model of ZFC, got the V there. Then you just add the classes on top. And given a model of GBN, you can get down to a model of ZFC by forgetting the class layers. So we have something back and forth from ZFC. So it feels like you can see some argument toward it being equivalent. We end up back where we started, but we have to figure out what the arrows are in this category. Okay. So here's the category that we're going to use. It's a little bit technical. This is quite a short definition. It doesn't work as well as it could, but if I give you the one that works better, it takes more, the definition becomes much longer to go into. Okay, so what I'm going to use is my structures. So I'm going to use a strong logic. So instead of using like omega models or transitive models, I'm actually going to take initial segments of the entirety of the universe. It's known as a V alpha segment. These are very good in the sense that they get much more than natural numbers right. They're well-founded. They're actually closed under subsets. If you're looking for a good model of set theory, these are the ones. The thing we have to do a little bit of work with, though, is ordinary elementary embeddings won't work. So there's a technical thing that I have to take care of. So I'm going to use what are known as cofinal elementary embeddings. And these are the key thing here is in a set domain, if you go from n to n, the range of this function has to be unbounded in a set domain. So that'll be meaning to the side. Okay. For a theory T with a set domain, we're going to let TV, my names are terrible for this, denote the category restricted in this way. So like we had the transitive models of ZSC, this is going to be the V models of T. In this setting, we learn that ZFCV is actually categorically isomorphic to GBN min V. Okay. That's kind of nice. It's interesting. I don't know quite what to make of it fully yet. I'm still learning more about how it works. We have a natural generalization, however, of Morita expansion. It's much stronger than Morita expansion. And with a suitable restriction, so we have to be quite careful, we landed somewhere in between Morita equivalence and categorical isomorphism. There are also some things to be reserved about. Okay, so I've worked very hard to get the categorical isomorphism to work. In particular, in the category that I chose there, in order for there to be a single non-trivial endomorphism in ZFCV, so that's just having two structures in there and a map between them, which is not the identity. This is a large cardinal assumption known as I3. So it's got a terrible name because everyone hates it. Okay, and I think I've sketched it this morning, but I still don't have a great proof that actually cofinal maps when alpha is less than beta. Okay. There are ways to tweak this. But it's remarkable, I think, that such a seemingly innocent question can push us so quickly into the stratosphere of set theory. So that's the first thing I'm like, well, that's unusual for these sorts of questions to sort of bump into each other. Okay, another interesting feature is this result gives us much more than equivalence between ZFC and GBN. Okay, so here's the kind of idea. We might want to, so the whole idea with, maybe I'll get my pen again, I think. Here's the process of adding classes. So I'm going to start small here. So we're here and we add a layer of classes. But then we go, I've got a new model structure here. I'm going to have new subsorts definable in here. And I might go, okay, so why don't we try and add all of the definable subsorts again and again and again. If you know any set theory, this is very similar to how Gödel's constructible hierarchy. So in deference to him, I'm calling this L. Well then, if we keep on doing this as far as we like, actually, ZFCV and this thing where you keep on adding as many levels as you like are actually categorically isomorphic. And you're like, oh, okay. And it even turns out we don't even need to be conservative about adding definable subsorts. We go and add any subsort that you like. So this kind of makes me kind of constrained. We can actually go wild and go out like this and go up. Then actually these theories are actually, so you can add as many, so this is like repeatedly using the power set operation again and again. These are still going to be categorically isomorphic. So then you might go, oh, isn't that nice? You might also go, it's probably false. I mean, that doesn't seem like it should be true. So it's much more than we'd hoped for. So the first remark is really what's going on as a logician is I'm just not in control of this process yet. So I need to do more work to figure out how it should be operating. It might even be wrong. hopefully not mathematically, but philosophically, I think it'd be pretty weird to think of this very modest theory as being somehow equivalent to this crazy theory over here. So that's an interesting kind of feature of this sort of thing. Okay, so what to make of this? I'd like to understand whether this can be controlled. As promised, I'd like to now finally return to what I've called the blurring argument. So we might compare ZFC and GBN. So here we were not able to control the amount of structure that we were adding, but maybe we could think about ways of controlling the structure. So we know that we had a modest level of structure from ZFC to get a model of GBN. We add the definable subsets. And much more structure needs to be added to get to here. So we have this, how do we talk about the difference between this? But in both cases, we have a blurring kind of argument. So we take a model of ZFC and we blur it by adding, say, the definable subsorts, and with a model of GBN, this could be just the identity. We don't do anything to it. Okay. So the template is just some ability to measure how much structure needs to be added before differences are removed or become invisible. Okay, so my final thought on this now then is perhaps the next sort of way to try and tackle this kind of question is to think maybe chasing the functors is too high. I was certainly working hard to get them in there. Perhaps we can ascertain equivalence between theories just using a blurring argument based on measures of structure from mathematical logic. So the kinds of ways we might compare structure in mathematical logic are often a little different. So we might think about, can you compute one structure from another? Then we have a definability level here, so this is more like interpretation. Or maybe we can construct one from another. Maybe we can, one is an admissible set away from another. Or some bounded iteration of the power set operator, like our example from topology. All right, so some concluding remarks. So the main things that I've been trying to talk about in this talk are how we think of theories can actually affect the way they behave. This is my example, trying to sort of draw a distinction between use and mention and make something mathematical out of it. The seeming inexpressibility of some theories seems to be a lot less intractable than I'd previously thought. So this is something I want to try and think more about. And I think there's some interesting questions in here. And then finally, exploring the region between Morita equivalence and categorical isomorphism seems to offer a clearer perspective on the problem of theoretical equivalence and seems to also prompt some intriguingly deep logical questions which are worth investigating. All right. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Toby. I see David.
Can I ask more about why you're using categorical isomorphism rather than equivalence?
Yes. So the first answer is they come to the same thing with first order theories. There's a little bit of the axiom of choice I've used there. So some category theorists, the computer science type of category theorists might object to that, but the mathematician category theorists would be fine with it. So that's why. Yeah.
Thomas.
So it sounded to me like you were close to defining a generalization of Morita equivalence, like where you allow construction of power sorts in addition to, so you can now, given a theory, you can build a power sort of some, like a subset of objects of a particular sort. Sort of sounded like what you were conjecturing is that with that liberalization of Morita equivalence, you don't get a translation result anymore, but that liberalization of Morita equivalence is still less liberal than categorical isomorphism. So my question is, did you do that first thing?
I don't think I have yet. I mean, I think I think I've got a specific result, and that would be the natural way of trying to. I should try, if I had to go further with it, it would be a good thing to do would be to try and define exactly what. So the natural thing would be like, what is adding all of the Morita.
What is a power sort?
Yeah, what is it? So a definable power sort, I think, crucially. Yeah, but yes, what is that? And so I've worked in a theory where it's very convenient because ZFC is Morita complete, so I can just deal with subsorts and that's fine. But for an arbitrary theory, that question would probably be more difficult. But I think that would be a natural way of casting this result. Yeah.
Yeah, the reason it's interesting is like, because you look at Morita equivalence now, why those 4 construction procedures?
Yeah.
Like, why not other ones?
Well, I've often wondered if forcing you might be able to treat that as a kind of exponential. So if you as a sheaf construction, it's more or less a hand wave for me at the moment. I've done a little bit of work on it, but that seems like another natural category theoretic construction that might work here, and it does seem to fit into a, or just like what you might think is roughly an algebraic kind of interpretation.
Neil?
Yeah, I was just wondering, do you have a sense of how much this observation you made about topology kind of generalizes, where we can, instead of having to use infinitary logic to express something, we can just help ourselves to a sufficiently powerful higher order logic? Is that one way of thinking about what you're doing with the operation?
So I've come to this relatively recently, and I've started to think that maybe it can be done more. But I worry that. So my big question is: so can you take any categorical isomorphism and then turn it, just add enough structure that you can turn it into a definitional equivalence or a bi-interpretability result, something like that? And my project, I think, is to refine that question, because I think at present it could just be true. Like, so one thing. Well, just add the entire set theoretic universe and add the entire set theoretic universe to the other structure, and you go, well, yes, then they're going to be the same. So you need, and the fact that I've used power set twice makes me worried about it. It's always made me worried. But I assume most physicists would prefer to use second countable spaces. So there is a way of turning this down.
So David, I saw your question, but I wanted
To go after PPP first, so.
Yeah, so I was wondering about that second countable point, because I've been thinking a lot about this sort of stuff in a bunch of different contexts that I work in probability, and Teddy Seidenfeld keeps coming up with counterexamples to things, but they always involve these things that are not countably generated. And when everything's countably generated, everything works well. And I think, well, I'm just interested in representing the probabilistic mental states of finite beings, and finite beings, I think, are always only going to be dealing with countably generated things one way or another. And similarly, if we're interested in physical theories, you might think that we're only ever going to be pinning down the meaning of our theories through countable observations or countable whatevers. And I'm just wondering how broadly this might be able to sort of avoid the issues that you worry about. Like, specifically the second countable move in the case of topology. Do you have any thoughts about how broadly we may be able to make a parallel move for other things that are not topology, but that if we stick with countable stuff, we never get any of the pathologies arising?
Maybe I want to come at it from a slightly different angle. So I've done a lot of work on the generic multiverse as an alternative. So it's not Joel's one, that Steele's version, which is equivalent really to ZFC. And you might want to look at questions that are generically invariant and figure out. And so I'd like to maybe make a little taxonomy of questions that are out there where they are no longer theorems in Steele's system. So, and these will be things that generally involve cardinality that you've got in there. And because in a generic multiverse, you can always collapse.
Yeah.
And so that's what you're looking for, to look to as a kind of evidence that you aren't entangled with deep set theory, so to speak. So this might be just a different approach into that problem. That's probably how I'd start thinking about it.
Let me ask a question, then we'll go to David. This is connected to Thomas's question, but I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how to bring the topology example and the ZFC GBN example into closer contact. Like, as you were talking about the topology example, I was thinking, okay, so there's like it can be kind of a general strategy here where we're going to extend Morita equivalence by just like looking at the things that we have to quantify over, and then figure out how to sort of add more domains. And we're not going to satisfy all the Morita interpretation rules, but there are going to be other weaker rules that we can satisfy. And then it looked like you were beginning to do that, and then it became very, very complicated, and it looked like actually all of this is going to, it seemed much less certain about how things were going to end up. So what makes the topology case seem to work nicely? And can you think of like hallmarks Because the topology case frankly looks a lot more like the cases in physics
Yeah.
than the ZFC and
Yes, that I think so. So, I mean, I think the last part is in some sense, it's more something that I'm interested in. But I think also if you want to learn more about how reader interpretation works, this is a way to stretch it that seems relatively natural. So I don't know how to, this is definitely work in progress. I don't know how to tie these ends together. Maybe they won't tie together. Maybe I'll get further results which suggest they don't. But I'm interested that you think the topology case is more like the cases in physics. So the place I would look next, I think, to look for an example, this would be the Nesterov book and try and look at the.
No, that's what I was going
That's
to
what's
ask. I
gonna
mean, because it seems like that's a perfect example of a case where.
Definitely defined in there, so there is a sense in which it should work.
Yeah, well, I mean that we have something where there's a duality, and we know that it's it's not a definitional equivalence. It's really hard to see how it could be a definitional equivalence because we're talking about spaces.
Yeah.
But something like the topology trick sure looks like it's going to work.
Yeah.
And so what is the where would that fit in our hierarchy? Is that a kind of Morita interpretation, but now, a step up from that? Like, is there some sense in which I can think of?
I don't know how, I haven't got a good clean classification of it. I could probably, what I would be more comfortable doing is relating it, this is a common technique that we'd use in set theory, using for a certain class of models. So transitive models, or you want to use mice of certain kinds. So these have structural conditions on them. And then you want to know these kinds of relationships about more sophisticated structures. So moving to a strong logic and then noting that you can go backwards and forward. I can't tie the GBN thing into the topology thing, but the theme is that it's really just a common theme at this point within this work. So both of them are about adding new domains to try and get the structure to work. One is more modest. I haven't got it under control. And the other one is using these power set expansions, which I think we should have. But I mean, in general, set theory topology is deeply entangled with set theory. But if you're in restricted cases like second countable spaces, then much less so. So I can't really answer your question so much as just gesture where I think things might go.
Sorry, what was the example of where was the place to look next? I just missed that in that exchange.
Oh, is it this book by Jet Nestrua, which is like a Bourbaki collective of some Russian mathematicians called something about observables.
Okay, thank you.
Just following up the topology case again at a slightly more elementary level. I mean, I sort of had two thoughts pulled in opposite directions in the example. I mean, one of them would be, in topology, unlike in group theory or vector space theory, the very statement of the theory is set theoretic. And so we wouldn't be at all surprised if to axiomatize it, we need to be quantifying over sets of sets rather than and so on. And the thought that pulls in the other direction is it's true that I can strictly state the axioms of, say, group theory or vector space theory without reference to set theory. If you want to do any group theory, say, I'm going to need laser set theory. Not those for the standards of what you're doing here, but
people don't prove theorems using
not just to prove theorems, but to expand the content of the theory. I want to be able to define subgroups and quotient groups and product groups and groups of functions between groups. And I need, I don't need the transfinite hierarchy, but I certainly need at least a sort of finite iteration of set theoretic construction. And so there's a certain sense in which it sort of feels like any axiomatization of a mathematical theory that's rich enough to cover the way it's actually been used in mathematical practice is going to have to be an axiomatization that quantifies over at least finite iterations of set theoretic constructions on the elements.
I mean, I think we want to draw a distinction here. So this one comes from like Fefman or Stuart Shapiro has it. So algebraic versus non-algebraic theories or foundational versus non-foundational theories. So theories like group theory and topology is like this too. What you don't really work in a specific one so much. You're interested in mappings between them and constructions you can do on these structures. But a foundational theory like ZFC is an example of this, Peano arithmetic, Kripke-Platek set theory, homotopy type theory. These are theories that in some sense have an intended structure in which you try and embed other things. And you try and actually use that theory to prove things, or you make a claim that people are in perhaps, or it's an adequate model of what people are doing when they're doing mathematics or something like that. So I think in these foundational cases, it is much more like you are literally using the theory. So, and then you're speaking that language in some sense. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
we are actually at time. Join me in thanking Toby. We can start getting set up.
Oh, that's not good. My thing on the, sorry, that's really good.